All right, welcome back. I hope you're having an awesome time so far. Our next speaker is Hans Lee. He's the managing director at Hines. Please join me in welcoming Hans to our virtual stage.
Thanks, Patrika. Good day to everyone joining for the RETCON Office Summit from around the world. It's great to be with you to share my perspective on Flex Office or Space as a Service. Given the massive disruption that COVID-19 has caused in the office real estate sector over the past 15 months, I think it's particularly timely that we're talking about Flex Office as companies begin to return to the workplace. Before we dive in, I want to say thanks to RETCON for giving me the opportunity to join so many thought leaders to share our respective views on how technology is enabling the office segment of the real estate industry. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hans Lee, and I'm currently a managing director at the international real estate firm of Hines. For most of my 15 plus years at Hines, I've been on the front lines of our core business and have had the privilege of developing some incredible office campus, and office anchored mixed use projects, mostly in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And more recently, I've pivoted to Hines's Office of Innovation, where I've been leading our workspace as a service program, which we call Hines Squared. So, the landlord's case for Flex Office. Before we double click on this, I'd like to illustrate the occupier relationship with space providers. As you can see here, this is a happy arrangement. Larger companies with long-term space needs lease space from landlords, while smaller businesses that prefer shorter term commitments and outsource services license space from flex space operators. The operator is able to provide this space because it leases long-term space from the landlord. So everybody's happy in this ecosystem. However, what we've seen in more recent years is that large corporates also have a need for flexible term and also want hospitality-like services. And to the credit of companies like WeWork and Industrious and Convene, they've stepped up and provided this in the space that landlords lease to them with their space as a service model. So the changing needs of the tenant should provide a new lens in which to view them, which is as a customer. That's how flex space operators view our tenants. And that's certainly how tenants want to be treated as a customer. So with this paradigm, it seems to me that landlords and flex space operators are somewhat in competition. So how did we end up here? Let's take a trip back in time to understand the evolution of flex office. In the 90s, before millennials were even working, landlords were entering into a number of leases with serviced office or executive suite providers. Regus emerges as the leading provider of executive suites. And landlords liked their business of aggregating small tenant demand in the marketplace because it allowed us landlords and our leasing teams to focus on larger needle-moving space requirements, especially in our big properties. As most of you know, it takes pretty much the same amount of work to document a 1,000 square foot lease as it does a 100,000 square foot lease. So landlords, frankly, viewed the executive suite business as complementary to their own leasing efforts. In a way, it was a way to outsource small tenant leasing. But little did we know is we as landlords were providing the seeds of growth for a new business that would emerge. Before we get to that, let's turn to the end of the decade when the dot-com bubble burst, and many landlords, including us, experienced a precipitous decrease in space demand. So Regus also a warehouser of space, they were no different. And in fact, they were driven into bankruptcy in the United States because of the severe mismatch between long-term leases at really high rents and short-term license agreements that all but evaporated. So now it's the 2000s, and these lease defaults ultimately leave the landlord holding the bag, and the risk of the lease arbitrage model was really spotlighted and exposed. Now, a lot of the leasing activity leading up to this was in the tech space, and many of those defaults resulted in companies literally walking away from their spaces overnight. Brokers who were trying to release this space dubbed the space as plug and play because the improvements, the furniture, fixtures, the equipment, and even the office supplies were all left in place, and in many cases, virtually in new condition. As leasing activity slowly started to pick up, we observed that plug and play space that was functional, not overly customized, was moving pretty fast, actually. And I think this phenomenon really bolstered the belief that using spec suites as a way to increase leasing velocity was a clever way to deal with space that was pre-built, and in this case, pre-built by tenants. It wasn't quite plug and play when you do spec suites, but it wasn't short-term licensing. And landlords did improve space with pre-built offices, conference rooms, and in some cases, a kitchen. But these deals were still direct leases with landlords, and they weren't really flexible licensing arrangements. So now we turn to the last decade, and we see this new generation of executive suite providers, which are widely known today as coworking operators. The concept of short-term licenses is not new, but anyone who has spent time in modern co-working space knows that it feels much different than the executive suites of yesteryear. It's well designed, it's appointed with smart furnishings, and serviced with an office hospitality staff. Customer base was still a lot of the smaller occupiers like freelancers, and contractors, gig workers, but this time the so-called enterprise customers, larger companies, they were taking note of this kind of space, and their demand for this space was increasing. No matter, landlords were happy to sign operators up for long-term leases and let them do the work of licensing the space out. So clearly, us landlords, we didn't learn the lesson from the past. And that lesson is that the lease arbitrage structure is inherently risky and really fundamentally flawed. This, of course, reared its ugly head at the end of the decade when the COVID-19 epidemic expanded into a worldwide pandemic. So let's talk about flexible workspace today. As signs of the pandemic are subsiding and beginning to show in some countries, including the US, there is a sense of optimism and employment that the economy is growing again for expansion in this new decade. However, we all have a new perspective on what and where a workplace can and should be. That has led companies to completely rethink their workplace strategy. While we ultimately don't know how this decade will play out, if landlords have been paying attention, if we've learned some lessons from the past, we can posit a few things, including the following. First, as with many pre-pandemic trends, COVID has acted as a catalyst for change, changes that were already underway in the last decade. The need for flexibility and a higher level of service gave rise to WeWork and others. So this was happening before the pandemic. And as we talk to and survey occupiers now, amidst the pandemic, everything we're hearing suggests that the need for workspace flexibility and agility has only increased as COVID has really changed the thinking around office space. In the Building Owners and Managers Association survey, it's indicated that 61% of occupiers are reassessing space needs and ranked flexibility as the #1 amenity they are looking for from a landlord. Similarly, CBRE, they did a survey. 86% said that flex office will be part of the long-term real estate strategy. And they ranked flexible office as the #1 desired building attribute. Next, flexible workspace operators are not out of the woods. For every successful recapitalization like CBRE's investment in Industrious, there's a distressed sale like No Tail's fire sale to Newmark. And while WeWork is stabilized, to their credit, they've had a recent SPAC merger, so they have more capital coming in. On the other hand, there's a Regus, and Regus has filed dozens of bankruptcies at the SPE level and the unit level in order to protect their parent, IWG. So these third-party operators, the outlook for them is uncertain. Some of them are going to survive, some of them, it's hard to say. Next point, the lease arbitrage model is risky. I hope if you haven't learned anything in this yet, this is the lesson to learn because it's the third time I'm bringing it up. In the most recent earnings call from Boston Properties, they took a $38 million write-off in 2010-20 for scheduled rental income from coworking operators who signed long-term leases with them as they couldn't make their lease payments. That's a huge amount. And as you can see there in the quote from the president, they don't think they'll be doing these leases going forward. So if we as landlords continue to lease space to third-party operators, are we really going to expect a different outcome in the next downturn? But the good news is, as landlords, we have a say in the matter. We don't have to lease space to third-party operators. And in fact, my next point is that some landlords have taken matters into their own hands. They're providing their own flexible workspace product. In addition to Hines Square, Tishman Speyer, Brookfield, Oxford, Boston Properties, and others, they are developing their own in-house space as a service platform for their respective portfolios. And here's why. If you lease space from a third-party operator, they need to rent their space out to cover the lease payment they owe you. So they're financially driven to compete with you for space requirements in the marketplace. If you, as a landlord, have your own flex space operation, you can use it to support your direct leasing efforts for the entire building. In some cases, occupiers are considering both flexible space and direct lease space. By having your own flexible space operation as a landlord, there's no conflict between these two scenarios. Both landlord and occupier will be happy with whatever decision is made. And more, we are seeing direct space requirements paired with flexible requirements. If you recall from the survey, flexibility is now being viewed by occupiers as the top building amenity. As your own tenant customers have needs for flexible space, or maybe a meeting or event space that they require, why would you tell that tenant customer to go to a third party to solve that need? We as landlords, we're in the business of providing space. Think about the message that sends to your customer if you tell them, go somewhere else if you have a flexible space need. Landlords, that's your relationship. Don't you dare let others butt in. Lastly, there's the flexible rent premium. Yes, there's upside in renting out flexible space, but I put it last on this list for a reason. Because if capturing the upside is the only reason you as a landlord are considering this, then you're missing the point. Or literally all these points marked with check marks that are above the last one, which I just enumerated. Finally, And I think this is where I believe the next phase of adoption will be, is in the capital markets. And I know how important that is to investors and lenders. Investors and lenders are beginning to understand the need for flexible office space. And flexible office space is not going away as a need. These investors and lenders, they also know how to underwrite cash flows that behave more like that of a multifamily asset, since these are not long-term office leases. Both CBRE and Cushman & Wakefield, who of course are intimately involved in the valuation aspect of our business, they have put out white papers describing methodologies for valuing buildings with flex office. I highly encourage you to go read them, but the key points are as follows. Number one, the proportion of flex to the overall building shouldn't be too large. The cap should be somewhere around 15% of the gross leasable area. Number two, you will get credit as a landlord for the flexible income with only the over market portion of the rent capped at a higher rate. So that's important. There's no penalty. You're just adding a little bit of extra risk for that flexible rent premium. And then third and lastly, once again, underlying long-term leases are bad. That should be crystal clear by now. So our view is that flexible workspace in a building will not negatively impact value, but given the real value it actually provides to the end user, to the customer, and therefore by extension to the building, asset performance and therefore value is actually enhanced by a well-run flexible space operation where the landlord is intimately involved. This concludes my discussion. I hope you found it thought-provoking. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn. I want to thank RETCON again for the opportunity to be part of this amazing event and wish everyone a great day at the conference.
Wow, thank you so much, Hans. If you could stop sharing your screen, I know the virtual crowd is waiting to give you a huge virtual round of applause. Awesome, well, thank you. We really appreciate you sharing these insights with us. For the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and take some time to check out our amazing exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.